That's Nerdist Book Club's logo. You would have heard a little violin playing, but it mutes me, so I can't do it anymore. What's up? My name is Maude Garrett. You are watching Nerdist Book Club. It is week 1 of 2 for a brand new book for this month of September. And we cast a vote on the socials. You guys voted. We're getting our dragon on. But before I continue to drag on, I'd love to introduce my co-host, Rachel Heine.
Hello.
Coming live from the Nerdist Studios in Hollywood.
I know, I'm out of my cave. So hopefully the sound is better this week, but excited to dive in. We have so much to talk about.
Yes, and here at Nerdist Book Club, we have a democracy. As I said, we did a vote. The poll was in, and because of the success of House of the Dragon, we put in a suggestion for High Fantasy September to do Fire and Blood, and it absolutely blitzed the poll. And so if you have any complaints about the book, you did this. You did this to all of us.
Yeah, us too.
Just a cheeky 800 pages from George R.R. Martin to flesh out the history of the Targaryens over the centuries prior to Daenerys Targaryen burning King's Landing to the ground. Stargirl314 says, I beg to differ. I voted for a different book. Look, I'm actually loving the show. Last week I was on All Kings Considered to talk about House of the Dragon. Are you watching it, Rachel?
I am. I have not watched the most recent one or two. I just caught up on it because I have been in my hyper focus of a series of books and have not wanted to watch TV. And then on Sunday, I caught up with a bit. Super digging it. And, you know, what's his name? Matt Smith just chewing up the scenery at every moment, which I appreciate. So enjoying it so far. Definitely interested in how this book is going to inform the season, the show, and how there might be twists coming in the show that might be different from the book.
Yes, this is just borrowed from, basically. They're using this as influence, and already we've seen some changes made to cater for the storytelling and the succession of how things are said. But Madeline Kay, for being more of a history, I'm surprised how easy of a read this is so far. As long as you get into the headspace that you are just going to be inundated with information, then you're totally fine. And I've got a bit of feedback on how to get into that headspace and how long it took for me. Stephanie, lovely to see you again this week. Said it wasn't that hard to read. It's getting the book that was the hardest. Yes, this has been absolutely front and center in bookshops, on Audible, all the great places that you get books because of the success of the show and people wanting to know as much information as possible. So in saying that, yes, things that happen in this book have already happened on the show, and there will be spoilers in this episode. If you don't want any spoilers for the show, a heads up, we will be talking a lot about the history and the events leading up to where the show takes place. But by the end of this show, around sort of like the 45, 50-minute mark, we will absolutely be chatting about television spoilers. Andrea Gilly says, I think this series is slower than Game of Thrones. Loved the performances, struggling with the rhythm of the story. Luke's digging the new show as well. And yes, a reminder for Nerdist, you are at the home of a lot of House of the Dragon content. If you are looking for an after show where we have experts and people who really know their stuff, and sometimes a Maude will show up just to kind of maybe ruin your day, then make sure you check out All Kings Considered. If you're watching on the YouTube channel, it's right here. Pop a bookmark in, give it a sub, a like, anything that will get notifications coming to you. You can expect those on Tuesday. It gives you a couple of days to digest before you tune in with your community. So, Rach, I kind of want to talk about
two quick housekeeping notes. That was because we had Monday off for Labor Day. They are on Mondays usually. And if you want to dive even more into the history of Game of Thrones, including from this book, but also the previous books and little bits of history there, you can go to just search Game of Thrones on Nerdist, and we have a bunch of really in-depth history breakdowns for different characters who might be relevant in the new show. And they have helped me since the first Game of Thrones. I did not read the original series. I tried once and didn't get into it.
This is my flex every time.
I know you've read them so many times. I know.
Not so many times. In fact, confession, since this is a safe space.
It is.
I only read the first half of the final book that he read. I stopped because I wanted to read the second half of that book going into the final book, thinking that it would be out.
Mm-hmm.
So I've read nearly all of the series that's come out. What's really
it's not a great incentive for me to start reading it, knowing how the emotional roller coaster that fans of the book series have already been on over the many, many years. But definitely while the show was airing, I love, diving into the history, into the lore of any kind of thing, whether it's Marvel, Star Wars, anything that, I don't know every single thing about. So if you are looking for more of those breakdowns, go to nerdist.com and search for Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon. All right, let's do it.
Well, I really want to address the dragon in the room for this one. And that is George R.R. Martin was supposed to write this and indulge in this series, focusing on the history after he's told the whole story of A Song of Ice and Fire. So this book was supposed to be after, but he hasn't written the final book. He hasn't finished telling this epic tale. We were told through a different lens, not of the original authors, but through the eyes of two showrunners, writers, executive producers. And it wasn't
were in a rush
to get it out so that they could jump ship to Star Wars. And that the plug got pulled on them.
Yep.
So you can't count your dragon eggs before they've hatched. And what ended up happening is this is a great time for would have been a great time for George to be like, oh, they didn't stick the landing. They didn't stick the King's Landing. Here is what I was thinking the entire time. But now that we've seen the show really crash and burn, and we didn't get the finish of the book, and now we're already on to the next thing. Like, is it thank you, Lee, is it too late do we still care about the end of Game of Thrones since someone else has finished it for him and we're already on to the next thing? Do you think, Rach, that he was right in dropping that and just moving on, or are you cranky too?
I mean, I don't want to speak for George R.R. Martin's personal or professional life choices, but I do think that for me, if he were to publish the last book, I would definitely try to read the whole series because I would be very interested. We here at Book Club love to compare and contrast source material with adaptations, what worked and what didn't. And I think that would be very compelling for me because of how rushed the last 2 seasons were, in my opinion, at the expense of a lot of character development, at the expense of anything making sense with magic and sort of the supernatural stuff in there. So I know at least one writer for Nerdist who does a lot of our Game of Thrones coverage, who All Kings Considered, who it's like a painful thing that they haven't finished the books. And so I would be interested just to see what his version would have looked like. I know the show, he told the showrunners some details about how the story ended, but not everything. And because I don't think that their strengths were really succeeding, or their strengths were with the characters, they really wanted to do these big bombastic battles and sort of set pieces. So I'd be interested to see the character development.
I hear you on that. I'm going to read out some of the comments weighing in on this. Jay Buntrock jokes. What if George R.R. Martin just copies the final episodes verbatim? That's how I guess the lol is supposed to sound. Ian says, this is flushing out works written for anthologies. Yes, that is true. Stargirl says, I still want his ending for it. Daenerys needs vindication. I like that one. And Andrea reminds us, that it's not about how a story ends. It's all about the journey there, and if the end has sense to that journey. True, true,
Yeah,
true.
absolutely. Because I believe, like, I can see what happens with Daenerys, even what happens with Bran a little bit, and Arya, all of those components. I can see how you would get there, but because they rushed all of that, especially with Dany, it just felt like Multiverse of Madness a little bit, where you just skip over the character development. Like, I needed so much more before we got there, so you could really understand, why she ended up there.
So we have a lot to get through with this book. We are going to hit through some of the points. There's a lot of chapters. It starts at 0 AC, and AC stands for Aegon's Conquest. So we're going to start there. We're going to chat through some discussion points, but there is so much, so don't mind us if we just start charging through it all. We literally have a document here that Rach, and a little bit, I put in some things, 15 pages. There's 15 pages of things. So we might run over a little bit is my guess, since we're already 10, 15 into it. So let's kick things off. Now, to summarize, we start off 0 AC, Aegon's Conquest, the story of how the Targaryen family left Valyria for Dragonstone and how Aegon won the first, and his sisters/wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, conquered Westeros. Let's get some history on. It's exactly right. I would say that the first quarter of this book was a little hard for me. The first sort of talking about Aegon's Conquest, I was just desperate for some dialogue, narrative. But as soon as I understood the pacing and what we're trying to get through, and as soon as the story pertained a little bit more to where we were at with House of Dragon, I was in. How did you find sort of the way the information was laid out, Rach? You're muted. Jimmy says, snooze fest for sure. Jeff 2.0 says, my issue is that if the story seems to be leading somewhere, but there's no payoff or it doesn't make sense, then you have diminished the journey. There you go.
How's my mic?
Yep.
I thought I beat it. So I went in after the book one, someone in the chat, or someone's in the chat, noted that it was a history and written that way. So I at least went in sort of prepared for this style of writing. I do find it super interesting that you kind of have it from, like, it's almost like a biblical like rendering, because there are different maesters who are writing it, and depending on the maester, they're pulling from different kinds of sources. You wonder what sort of like personal biases they might have towards a particular story. So once we're done reading it, I kind of want to dive into that because I found that interesting. I definitely, like you said, like I just needed to be in the right like mood to listen to it so that I wasn't just completely spacing out. I will say this book reminds me of why for a very long time I didn't read a lot of high fantasy, because I have ADHD and aphantasia, which means I can't picture things. And so when there are so many names, so many places, and so many dates, and it doesn't feel like personal or concrete, it can be very hard for me to keep track of it. But I do think I've like gotten better at it, and I was taking notes because I want, this is so in depth. And also, like in any sort of evil and or high fantasy setting, they name their kids the first, the second, a lot of the same ones. So just going through it, that has been a little bit of a struggle for me, but I do like getting some of this history and what is said without being said throughout. I think the through line of, which is especially, I think, pertains to House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, it's sort of the systemic devaluing of men as the show and the book show, with different views, ways to portray that in the show than in the book. Your mileage may vary on that component. But I do feel like although we don't get insight into these characters necessarily, it's sort of what people thought they were thinking was, and all of those types of things, that the the through line of the different women and how their stories are told versus like what you can kind of read into what actually happened. But just for an example, with Aegon's conquest, the fact that Visenya and Rhaenys were such a crucial part of that, and we do get some information about them working with Aegon, but it's just interesting to kind of consider how would this have been portrayed with a different kind of historian who would value the women more as like characters than what they did.
That's a really good point. I found that with like trusting the source, trusting the author, that was a little bit, for me, the style is history. So if you're going to have an unreliable narrator with no other form of corroboration, that for me is a little bit sort of like irrelevant then. So if we're only presented with a version of the truth as a historic event, then that becomes truth, as we know with a lot of literature that's been passed through millennia. You can even pick and choose what you choose to believe with this one. There are several times where a maester will go back and add in postscript, or you have two unreliable narrators or versions of events, one from a maester who's quite pious, another one from Mushroom, who is notoriously known for eavesdropping, but also exaggerating and, making it a lot more nefarious than it could be. We don't know. So it's like your job as the reader to kind of get the difference there. But for me, it's like, if you're not going to tell a story, you're only going to reveal sort of like fact as fact. I'm just going to believe it, and I'm not going to look for truths or whatever. It's like I'm just literally consuming what's presented. I will say I'm super, super jealous, Luke Easton. I did love the pictures in the book. The art is top notch. Oh, as someone who's listening to it, that is devastating. Because that's all I was thinking. I was like, I need to be able to see this, even if it's a timeline where I can see what years these things are taking place. Like, I need to be able to visualize that. And that wasn't something that I had the luxury of listening to it. Simon Vance, usually I think this is our fourth Nerdist book that Simon Vance has narrated. He also did Interview with the Vampire, Dune, and another series on the side that I've listened to. But I actually really like his David Attenborough-esque take with this historical fiction. So that was a lot of fun. But then someone else says that there's notes in the margin as well. And that's something that I really, really, really wish I was able to see too. Pylang, yes, lovely to see you here. There's a PDF in the Audible that has the illustrations, says Darian Bahari. That's exactly why we have commenters. Really appreciate that. That's going to be a game changer for me. Yeah, thanks for that one. And actually, is it Andrea made a really, really good point. All history is written by unreliable sources. You're exactly right. That's right. This is fiction.
And have their own biases based on the time that they're writing them, their involvement, especially looking at, power dynamics and like how between the small folk and the more lowborn, between the women and the men, even looking at, I'm going to scroll down to their names because there's so many names in this book. It was, what is his name? Where is he? It's the Jaehaerys and Alison. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I really, I found it really interesting how both of them are slightly more, they try to be better rulers, and especially Alison, like she sees the plight of the lower born women and how women are treated and all of these practices. And yet it's time for her to marry all of her daughters off. Both of the king and queen just discard their wants. All of those things where there's this disconnect still of, she can see this in her subjects and feel such empathy for them, but for her own family, it's like, this is just how it is. And especially thinking about monarchy, with recent events and the wall-to-wall TV coverage of the path of a monarch at the expense of important local domestic stories and things like that, but also the rules of succession, all of the infighting. I really liked seeing sort of, no matter what, in each sort of reign of a different leader, you could be completely psychotic and vengeful and vindictive. You could be kind and try to be a ruler. And no matter what, at some point, there's going to be more infighting. There's going to be some sort of power grab because it's just built upon this firstborn son. But everyone dies so frequently in Westeros too. The sort of like coin toss of succession, which is obviously what House of the Dragon has largely been about so far. It's almost like parents who are too overprotective and parents who don't pay enough attention. And both of those things can cause trauma. And it's sort of like, no matter what you do, the monarchy is inherently not a good thing. So it always ends in bloodshed. I can't hear you. Did I do that? I can't hear Maude. Is it just me? Oh no.
It just randomly
Oh,
muted.
there it is. Oh,
Just
I thought it was
randomly muted
me.
on me.
I thought it was me. I was like,
I didn't even touch it. I didn't even touch it. That's we got a scary little micro. I made a really good pun as well. I was like, in Westeros, if you're a dude, if you're a man, you die by the blade. If you're a woman, you die by the babe. And that's kind of it, you know?
I know.
That's I've just heard 150 years of how people died, and that's kind of those. Or you defy your parents, or you get drunk. Man, that's kind of it.
And
there you go. My mic is fixed.
Yes.
I was on a roll, David. I was. I was going to keep talking about some of the other things to tackle because we're 20 minutes in.
Let's do it.
Okay. The Reign of the Dragon, the Wars of King Aegon I. We can skip that.
Yeah.
We learn a little bit more about Dawn. I love the fact that Dawn constantly don't want to be a part of this. They're like, you know what, mind your own business. We're over here doing our thing. That's all you need to know.
And also they seem to, at least, you know, in terms of Game of Thrones, they respect their women a lot more and have matriarchs in charge, like Maria Martell, and the way that she is the one who can keep Aegon on his toes for years, and the way she is
described.
Yeah, the way she's described and sort of like her trickery and like a woman's ways of winning and stuff, and it's like, but yeah, she had him on the run. So the only way that ended was she got too old and died. So.
And I feel like, you know, when you look at the scope of how women are written in this world as well, it's more often than not, it's a slog. It's not great. And then every now and then we have this impeccable female character where I don't know if it's necessarily a redemption, but there is enough of a scope that we are seeing both sides where a woman like Alison will meet her people, will give women a voice, will outlaw so old antiquated laws where it just makes zero sense, like the law of the first night, where if anyone gets married, a lord is able to take the wife on the first night. That makes no sense. And to hear kind of how that was challenged in the council by Alison, just being like this, like, it's not only discrediting and awful for women who are essentially, you know, getting taken by a stranger on the wedding night, but what really, this is what sucks, but what rang true for the men hearing it was that it was also slighting men, because it was able to say that, you know, even though you're consummating a marriage, a man can sleep with that. And it's also affecting the Lord's wife. And it's just like, why are we doing this? And like, well, people don't even really do it anymore. Then outlaw. That was my favorite part of this first part of the book. I was like, yes, Alison, listening to the women, really kind of like scratching out those old laws. Exactly. Game Wizard saying, I liked Alison had women's court to hear female grievances. It was great. And I kind of love that even though it was one woman, but it was a woman who had incredible power, who was using that to give an entire gender in that time a voice. Thank God. Because we're dealing with not only incredible sexism and this is a whole part of why this book has legs. It's because can the heir go through the women's side, or can a woman be an heir? And that's why we have this war in the first place. But it's just nice that it's recognized in a part of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of the Targaryen women in this section of this first half of the book are all rebellious. They have their own minds. They have different, to varying degrees. But there is saying about how they're fostering, or how their family in between generations, you can see when a father or a husband listen to the women in his life more, and that ends up, for the next generation. And then we get to the point in House of the Dragon where it's still not going to be good enough. And this sort of, in the show, I loved the conversation between oh gosh, so many names. The main
Who are they?
one, Renara, Rhaenyra, and her aunt. And there's this sort of conversation that they have about, is anyone about the feasibility of a woman ever ruling? And it reminds me a little bit of generational divides during the height of Me Too happening, where you had women of older generations, not all of them, some of them, who kind of had the mentality of, well, I had to go through it. It's never going to change those things. And I think it's interesting to see that woven through this story as well, because I hope that House of the Dragon is really taking this is like some galaxy brain shit, but I feel like George R.R. did do that, of the action, like taking this historical piece, but the show is about what really happened and what the women, like, sort of way more from the women's perspective and what they're thinking, that we don't get a lot of in this book. Like that to me would be genius. But we'll see.
It is interesting to look back, like the discrepancies, being a noble, but even that not sort of being immune or above the law in a lot of the times. And it's saying like there are times where you think that your actions aren't being monitored or watched. But then, of course, I'm just thinking about the Princess Sarah, who was so rebellious and didn't think, because she was so far down, she was like the seventh child or something, didn't think anyone was watching, anyone would care. And then they just ran amok. They had rebellious teenage years. It all came to fruition when one of the maidens was pregnant and they don't really know who the father is. And then, even though they were a tight little knit group, and initially Jaehaerys was like, oh, they're just having fun, I'm not even worried about them. And it's like, you should be. And she just kept sort of like being rebellious. And one of them got his nose and tongue cut out. I think another one was like purposely married off. Like they had huge consequences for those actions. And she was sent away and then still tried to rebel from being a silent sister and ended up in a whorehouse for the rest of her life.
Yep.
Because that's what happens when you're a woman who wants to be rebellious and not follow the rules. That's the only place really that you end up, according to Georgie boy.
Which is very rich considering Jaehaerys and Alison and how they went against the Queen Regent's wishes and married each other because they siblings. And I also love, and I know this happens in the Game of Thrones books as well, but I love sort of allusions to other big historical moments in our history that could be referenced. Like to me, there was something about the doctrine of exceptionalism, which was supposed to kind of combat against the faithful, the religious zealots, and everyone sort of being like, you can't marry your sister, you can't take second wives. And that was supposed to sort of legitimize that. And it just reminds me of Henry VIII and the Church of England, and sort of just doing everything that they can so that they can do what they want to. But then,
Yeah.
as you become more powerful, as you get, this is before he was old enough to actually rule, and you see the realities of this world, and then they don't have the same understanding for their children not wanting what they set out for them either.
Yep. And it is interesting when you are in like such an elite position of power, just to pick and choose what rules do apply to you when you're in that stage. I mean, you see Damon saying, well, our ancestors had 2 wives. This is in the show, so I'm going to do the same thing. And then you have Queen Alicent. I'm skipping way ahead. But even though Viserys, the king, quite clearly stated an heir, she was like, no, I don't want that. Even though it's set in stone and that's exactly, the order of things. Nah, no thanks. Doesn't suit me, so I'm going to change it. Sure. Anyway.
I also think it's interesting just seeing it from sort of Aegon as he's conquering, and we get to kind of the skirmishes and uprisings at the beginning of his reign, and how after all of these years of bloodshed, he really wanted to rule more peacefully. And then you get his second son, who is just very intense, Maegor. And that section was really interesting because you kind of see, in Game of Thrones, the show and the books, you see the sort of mad king, the mad Targaryens, all of that is alluded to. And you sort of get to see this vicious ruler who is willing to do anything to win, and can't even bear the idea that maybe he's the one who can't bear children. So he goes just absolutely off the wall, torturing people, killing people, vengeful, and ends up impaled on the Iron Throne. But I found too that the Holy War was super interesting. It just feels like time after time with the Targaryens and Westeros that they try something like that, and the religious faithful kind of rise up in their assassination attempts, but they continue to do it. And a question I have for you is, it was the Queen Regent, who is Alyssa, and I believe, anyway, the Queen Regent, Jaehaerys's mother. And I sort of got her perspective of having seen all of these years of bloodshed over the first marrying within your family or having multiple wives in Westeros, where it's not Valyria. And I kind of understand her trying to stop them because she knows that it's just going to rile up all of these people, and no matter what they're doing, they're just drawn to that incestual thing, I guess.
I mean, it's fictional, so someone's writing it. I really question it. There's just so much talk of incest, and there always is in this world, and it's probably based on what our history could have been like.
But also, actual monarchies, it was very common in the early days of monarchies, where there are cousins and things like that. So it's also a question of what is that doing to how they handle conflict as a family.
I am surprised that so many of these children born from a brother-sister relationship are healthy.
But a lot of them are not, especially ones who
But it's usually once the woman is older. It's never the firstborn. It's usually the 8th child.
Yeah. But
so that again puts the blame on the woman being too old to bear healthy children, and not the fact that brother and sister are stoinking.
Or that,
I've got uncles and brothers. Reading this book is tough.
Yeah, it is tough. And I also think, like, one of the things that your point about we're reading this as we're not getting another perspective on what happened. But when, gosh, who was it? It was Maegor's wife, um, who couldn't have a child. And there's this whole story about how her father, who was the hand of the king, brought in 20 virile men of all ages and everything. And, Maegor's out. They're all murdered. I just kept thinking, like, there is no way that's the correct side of the story. Like, that to me says that the dad made this decision to keep him and his family in power, and that was choice. And so that's what I find, horrific, but also interesting of what is between the lines here. There's a book that I love that's based on a basically 1 or 2 line character in the Bible called The Red Tent. I've brought it up before. And it just is this whole rich life of all of these women from that perspective. So yeah, I just hope that's sort of how House of the Dragon is tackling it, which so far I'm enjoying.
I really just want to address the fact in the Maegor reign that his brother's name was Anus. I don't care how you spell it. Anyway,
That's true.
It's funny though. Never really that name didn't stick. It's Aegon or other ones or Aemond, but Anus didn't stick. Anyway, moving on. I just need to get that.
I love it. I have a question for the group. After Maegor's sort of very vicious reign, and he is murdered, I think it's presumed to be either by his own Kingsguard, potentially, one within the castle. He meets with his council, they leave, and he's okay. And then the next morning, he's found impaled on the Iron Throne. So I think they got sick of his shit after a while, especially with a new prince to sort of ally with. But
that's what happens though, and I like that bad rulers have consequences most of the time. You look at other Game of Thrones history, and it's like everyone thought that the Bolton, the dad, was bad, and then meet his son, who's a byproduct of abuse and becomes even worse than that with Ramsay. Yeah. But then here, like, there are particular times where it's like, if there's another option, that's how the end of Game of Thrones happened. You can't burn down a whole entire city without getting a dagger in you by your nephew lover. God.
Thanks, I hate it. Thanks, I hate it. God, what a bummer. But there was this.
So anyway, it moves into Jaehaerys.
Yeah, something I found weird and interesting was Rhaena's twin daughters, Rhaella and Arya, and how they were very, very different personality-wise. And after Jaehaerys has his coronation, there were rumblings that the twins had switched. And what would be the reason? Just one of them, the mother thought one of them was more suited to being the next heir than the other.
Wasn't one of them a brat? One
of
them was like an actual punish, or one of them was just quiet and the other one was confident?
One was quiet and one was like loud and outgoing and doing all
That's right. And she went away quiet and came back a boisterous young girl.
Yeah. I was just wondering if anyone had thoughts about why that might be, because I love a swap story and I want to know that detail. I was like, why to do this?
Avoid spoilers. This isn't the last time that twin swapping occurs.
That's true.
I think in this day and age, deception is really kind of deception is a weapon in this war, and it's any means of deception that you can have. And I think being a twin is an asset in terms of that deception. But we have to look back to the fact that this is all called the Game of Thrones, and it's whatever you can do to assert yourself higher in prominence at whatever means. There are other the girls that are like, well, this guy's a widow and he has to remarry, so I'm just basically going to throw myself at him because it will take my rank up. That's what's important. Arya was the brat, stole Balerion, and supposedly went to Valyria. There you go. Thank you, Aaron, who listened to the book better than me.
We're trying. I also
Michelle
think
says
it's.
you,
Go ahead.
I was going to read a comment real quick. Michelle says, definitely a marriage potential decision. She has to be attractive so that no one will question a match. A more difficult personality is not as marriable. 100%.
Exactly why I am so difficult. Don't try to marry me. But I think the other interesting thing that leads kind of into the year of the three brides, where we've been, obviously there have been marriages and births and all of those things, but it's been a lot of war. And we get into how these three different weddings and marriages impact the future of kind of the political chessboard and all of those details. And I find it not surprising, but interesting that so much of how men affect change in Westeros, or
No, you muted. Oh,
I did?
you back.
Oh, hi.
You did for a second.
Weird that they achieve, more power, influence, or fail due to their actions in war, whether they go to war, whether they don't, whether they forgive, whether they don't. And women, the only real like element of power they could potentially have is by marrying or by having an heir or doing that. And so I found sort of the whole thing is kind of just a history of wars, marriages, babies,
Death. Yes.
and
Funeral.
and comparing that with the first episode of the show and seeing Viserys's wife and the horrific things that
Emma?
and they all do to her. But before that happens, her sort of acknowledging her only power she can wield is in this way. And so it just, not only does it just happen to them, but it more of the smaller deceptions that the men and the maesters write about being so evil and malicious, that's their only option. So I
All they've got.
sort of breaking that apart was really interesting to me.
Also, the Queen Regent Alyssa marrying Roger Baratheon. I loved her. I like Alyssa. She's like, you know what? This could be bad. I'm going to find the good in it. I'm going to ride dragons and I'm going to ride my husband. And that's what she did by day and night. You know what? She seemed like the happiest of them all.
And
she died childbirth.
Yeah, and she was right to caution her children against marrying because it caused even more problems with them. But yeah, she died in childbirth because her husband got to make the call, like in Bridgerton, if you've seen or read, where he said save the child instead of the mother. And he was an interesting character too, because you see him really try to go up against the Queen Regent's son, the now king, and then sort of repent and then continue, like he breaks bad and comes back. And that's an area of the book too where historians are sort of talking about more of the complexities of good and evil. So I want to know how everyone thought about what they thought about Roger, that guy.
Roger, it is bath time, and I have a Becky for you. That is a famous Australian ad that only me gets. That's fine. Roger. I thought it was. Maybe it is Rogar. Who knows? I know. Someone will know. The chat will tell us.
Yeah, please. Help us. So many names. Question? Just sort of, how did you view him as a character and sort of his choices? Because I think in the context of the history, the Maester was sort of commenting on no one being truly good, truly evil.
And honestly, at this stage, anything in the first quarter of this book, I deem is not important.
Okay, well, let's keep going because we got more to get through.
Yeah.
We should.
I didn't think he was a bad man.
This one. Yeah, I kind of get what he was doing. I think the thing I hate him the most for is letting his wife die, but that was very common. So
So now that I'm actually up to the part in the document, he was one who sends a spy to seduce the king but doesn't succeed. I actually think that this is more of a testament to how Jaehaerys ruled as a king in comparison to his predecessor, Maegor the Cruel, and was able to lead. And he was in power for 55 years or something. You know, he was a king by like 14. So this was the difference, where it's like, even though you had the thought of doing something wrong, you couldn't execute your plan. Therefore, I will show mercy. I actually really liked that moment. And I think that ruling by fear can get you loyalty in one way, but ruling with compassion will get you loyalty for life.
Well, you look at Maegor too as well, and how he ultimately ends up
They
as soon
turned
as
on
there
him.
is a better option. And so much of, not even just with Rogar, but even the traders, anyone who was going up against Maegor, he allowed them to live, just swear fealty to me. And I think you see it's very similar to any kind of political situation where you have years of one kind of mindset power, and then inevitably there is the next, because they're kind of these opposing forces that have these ebbs and flows. And I just am interested to see in the second part of the book if we, like, obviously we're going to descend into more madness before we get to the events of Game of Thrones, but if there are more successful like reigns like that where they are trying to be a benevolent ruler.
It's terrible, Jimmy. So I personally love the fact that Jaehaerys and Alison, even though they're brother and sister, and that's how they ruled for a very, very long time, I love the dichotomy between the two, where it was not good versus evil in terms of sort of like the yin and yang that they had there, but it was like compassion for law and the estate and the noblemen, and then passion for the women. And so it was kind of looking at all the hierarchies, all the classes, and everyone was kind of covered by the way that they were governed in a way that sorted and suited a lot of people. So I really liked that. There was a little bit of a snafu during their ruling, though, and that's Alison's friend who decided to, even though they were besties for life, decided to get free, find her own solace, live her best life, and stole 3 dragon eggs.
Interesting.
Couldn't be found, changed her name. And
wonder where those dragon eggs may have ended up. I don't know if that's the same ones, but
has to be.
It has to be
3
right?
convenient
They're just
eggs
napping until they get
that were sold to
Targaryen
a
again.
wealthy merchant who says they're likely just stones. Boop, boop, boop. If they're putting half of a chapter towards it, it's got to mean something, is my theory. But the discussion that we have with this one, Alison and Jaehaerys, are they ruling as equals, knowing that Jaehaerys is technically the king? Does Alison have enough power, and is she bringing enough to the table for? Oh, that wasn't Alison's friend; it was Rhaena's friend. Thank you, Tate, Jessica Tate. Thank you so much for that.
Friends?
It was. Oh yeah, totes more.
Yeah, they were roommates. Yeah, that there was essentially a rumor that he only married her 17-year-old husband because she was in love with his sister. And I appreciate that even in Westeros, 2 very close women who share a bed they're just man, they're just hanging out. Yeah.
Laenor has, his very handsome squire, Joffrey, of the Knight of Kisses. They're just perfecting their night moves and stuff. No funny.
Working on the. Couldn't help it.
But the Farmans, something that I'm noticing as well, where it's like a lot of these names, Baratheons, Starks, Lannisters, they're houses and names that we've heard now, but some of these names haven't lasted the test of time, like Farman. The Farmans, they be farming, but they don't be breeding. Sorry about that one. Anyway, moving on.
That's true, to think of who was potentially eradicated, but also I will challenge when we get to the end, I think, you saying that the first fourth didn't matter as much to you, because I think that the way Aegon conquered Westeros at the beginning and after he had, officially been coronated, shaped the future of Westeros for so long, because he, after so many years of war, he didn't want to interfere in the different systems and customs and laws of these seven kingdoms. And so by not kind of unifying them in that way, it leads to all of the continuous like splintering, that the houses sort of keep their mantle. They're the wardens, so technically they still rule over that as much as they can, and so you keep sort of system in power. Yeah, I just found that really interesting. And also, I lost it. I had one, but it's gone. I'll think of it later.
You'll get it in about 7 seconds as I continue talking. Let me rephrase. I'm not saying that the first quarter of the book is not important. The first quarter of the book didn't make it into my memory. The first quarter of the book didn't permeate through my brain. They were just wafting words, and then I started giving a shit.
I was just teasing you.
No, but like, it's funny because it's like, it's probably really important. I couldn't tell you what happened. First quarter of the book, words. But then it stuck and it got quite interesting. Just like when the heirs of the dragons. This is the thread that started getting pulled. And this is where Jaehaerys, we have to remember, ruled for decades. He was king from about 14, ruled for 55 years. So the whole idea of an heir hasn't been a conversation that's been around for most people's lifetimes, especially considering the previous heir was killed so that there was a successor in place. So there wasn't ever this will be the heir once I die. That's a notion that hasn't existed within Westeros for ages. And so now succession is the most important thing now that Jaehaerys is, in his 50s, 60s. And he names his brother Balon as successor. And the crucial thing here is that he overlooks his daughter, Rhaenys. And Rhaenys, as we all know from the show, is the queen who never was, because there were so many times where it should have been Rhaenys that was led to the successor or named heir. But there's this whole debate in Westeros if a woman can reign, if a woman can be a queen and lead the seven kingdoms, or if the succession can even go through the woman, whether they name that woman's son, but it's always favoring the man. And so the amount of times that Rhaenys gets overlooked is a huge foundation for what's to come with the Dance of Dragons. So when Balon's named as a successor, he actually dies. I think it's really worth noting because it's never mentioned in the book, but the show jumps on this particular moment and uses it as a reference point for when King Viserys, and spoilers, we're talking show now, but in this recent episode, Viserys, I'll give you a second in case you want to mute, dismisses Otto as Hand of the King and uses this moment in history as a way to almost put blood on Otto's hands, insinuating that the fact that Balon was named successor, but he died. Wasn't Balon the Hand of the King? He was named Hand of the King as well, leading up to it. So Jaehaerys's brother becomes Hand of the King. His named successor dies in a year. And then it's Otto who is then instated as Hand of the King, because he was next in line. And Viserys is saying, have you been playing such a long game that the person who was one above you happened to die within 12 months from a burst stomach? That to me is too much of a coincidence. My guess is you killed Balon so that you could then become Hand of the King, because Otto Hightower was Hand of the King to Jaehaerys, who then succeeded Jaehaerys and became Hand of the King to Viserys. Balon was Viserys' dad. Oh, Otto killed his dad. Jessica Tate, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for that one. But yeah, we're chatting spoilers for that. It's not mentioned in this book. It's referenced in the show. Thought that was an interesting thing to tack on and to connect the two. But 103 AC, things start looking a little different. After 55 years of reigning, Jaehaerys passes. Viserys ascends to the Iron Throne. He and his wife Emma, they start conceiving. First child is Rhaenyra. Now, this is when shit gets interesting because these are the events of House of the Dragon. The next child is Aegon, who died a day after Emma did during childbirth. If you've seen the first episode of House of Dragon, this reveal was a gut punch because Viserys is asked again. This is the second time this has happened. First time we heard about it, it was in this book earlier. You must choose, who do we save? So this is somewhat a common instance in Westeros. He decides to save his male heir, Aegon, as Daemon then announces as the heir for a day because he's a disrespectful douchebag. And of course, he gets back to Viserys, who of course punishes him for 3 days before forgiving him because they're brothers for life, all that kind of stuff. But what's interesting is that we are now getting to the crux of what happens in the show. And we are learning about Daemon being the commander of the City Watch. And I put in the notes here, he's a chaos monster. He is enforcing the law by extreme means. And again, we see this dichotomy of Viserys, who is forgiving, who is just, who loved his wife, even though he chose to kill her.
That much.
Not that much. He just needed 2
Enough
healthy
to
babies
not-
because the babies are more important. And then we also learned that Daemon is the exact opposite, and he's chomping at the bit to become heir as well, and his disdain and jealousy. Oh yeah, put him up there.
There he is.
Daemon,
Like a
sitting
peekaboo.
on that iron throne where he shouldn't be. Sitting there alone is a traitorous act. But it's interesting now that we are getting to the part of Heirs of the Dragon, a question of succession. And this is the exact premise of House of the Dragon. My question here is that we have seen Viserys is only in power because Viserys' father and the previous successor of, uncle, the previous ruler, Jaehaerys, didn't opt for his own daughter, but opted for a male to succeed.
For his nephew.
So there he is, Paddy.
Yeah.
So in what way does Viserys feel and think that he can undermine his own rise to power? The only reason why he got there was because of the male succession, but to undermine that for his own daughter, why did he think that that would work? We're really getting into show conversation here as well.
It's hard to say. I feel like given what happened, what his choices with his wife and the prince for a day, little baby Aegon, I think that he regretted all of what he did, realizing it didn't matter anyway. And in that moment, being angry with Daemon, A, punishing him, and B, at that point he was like, I guess I just give up on having a son, because my wife just died in front of me horrifically. My son died after that. I know that my daughter is smart. I clearly don't. I want to punish Daemon right now, and so he doesn't.
The kingdom's
really,
delight.
He's a little naive, I think, in thinking that that's the end of it, and his mission to get an heir is just about him. It's not. It's about everyone else. And so when they tell him, this is why the show is great, because we get more of those personal moments, but of like what the history is.
We get dialogue, baby.
I know. But he not only realizes he has to marry again and have an heir, but he seems to really, in the show, really bristle when anyone tries to tell him what he should or shouldn't do. And he always does something a little different or a little bit of a fuck you. And even he does care and he's trying to be a good leader, he also doesn't want to deal with a lot of this stuff. He doesn't like being told he needs to pay attention to this or that, which is, if you're raised to become king, then, power does corrupt in some way. And I think he just doesn't want to listen to what other people think that he should do. He thinks that he's, right. Or he'll take lots of tidbits of information and then be like, nope, I'm going to marry my daughter's best friend.
And then realizes after the fact that he was played the entire time by Otto. He didn't understand that all of a sudden Alison just started visiting to console him. That wasn't put together in any particular way until after the fact.
Because it's unfortunately easy for these men to use their daughters or their wives to manipulate other men because they're so high on their own supply that and excited about a young thing that they don't even think like, could I be getting played right now? Because they just can't even fathom it. My own hand would betray me in such a way. All that jazz.
Aaron's saying, I'm hoping that if this show goes long enough, we'll be able to get to Robert's rebellion and ends the whole dynasty. That ends the whole dynasty and get into Dunk and Egg too. I wouldn't mind getting into Blood and Cheese, which also occurs in skipping quite a lot. What's interesting is that children are an asset here as well. Not only are they a bargaining chip, marrying your children off for a way to secure alliances and allegiances and loyalty, but you can also assassinate them. And that's this is catastrophic. Like you are seeing warring sides not back down to the point of a war happening, but also vengeance in a form of, well, your son poked my son's eye out. Well, your son rode on Dragonback and killed my son. Well, I'm going to send 2 assassins into your kingdom and I'm going to make you choose which son we kill. It just snowballs and stacks on top of each other until there's no way out but absolute devastation. And that's what we're getting towards. David Nichols says, a Dunk and Egg getting their own spin-off in development. There have been a number of different spin-offs. Some of them greenlit. Some of them a pilot was shot in its entirety for millions.
Written and run by women about women, which I would have. I'm enjoying the show, but I would love a perspective that isn't. We're going to show more societal violence against women. We get it.
And tits. All the tits.
Yeah, we get it. We don't need all of that.
There's a tit quota.
We don't need all of
that. We are at time.
Yeah.
But
go ahead.
There are crucial things happening in the latter chapters of this book, including the dying of the dragons, the blacks and the greens. This is a big thing I want to establish. We are looking at, and I hate to be basic like this, but we're looking at Team Alison or Team Rhaenyra. And it's your blacks, which is in the black corner. You've got the actual slated, documented heir of the throne, Rhaenyra Targaryen, who father was the king, Viserys, who named her heir crystal clear. And then you have Team Alicent, who is Viserys the king's wife, who has technically given birth to 3 children, 2 who are boys. And if we're going with this antiquated law of the heir has to be prioritized through the male line, then Alicent is correct in saying and demonstrating and pushing that her sons will be next in line. But because Viserys has been incredibly stubborn and will not refute on who he claimed and named the heir, Rhaenyra is technically next in line. What we find out are absolute spoilers for House of the Dragon, the show. So I'm going to go over this super quick. If you don't want to know, mute up a storm right now. But essentially, Alicent, children start growing. Rhaenyra has married Laenor, who doesn't last too long, even though they have several children. Turns out the children are not Laenor's at all, but, the strong, unbreakable dude. So she's just cheating left, right, and center, but good on her because she's getting some. Good for her. When he dies, it turns out on the side, Daemon married Laenor's sister, Laena. She dies during childbirth as well. So that, yes, Rhaenyra does end up with her fucking uncle, Daemon. They get together, have a few kids as well. While all this is going on, Alicent is raising her sons. They have absolute animosity from the get-go. And Viserys, who we've just seen has been quite sick, lasts a lot longer than anticipated. But when he finally does pass, Alicent keeps it under wraps, doesn't say shit, keeps his body literally rotting, and then announces her son, Aegon, as king. And this all happens while Rhaenyra is giving birth, I think, to her second son with Daemon. And they are not in the same place because they can't even be under the same roof. They can't even be on the same continent, basically. So she's not aware of what's happening. Turns out there is a succession. It's official. Aegon's been named the new successor. And then Rhaenyra catches wind and is shitty AF. Both of them send word being like, hey, bow down, no hard feelings. The other one's like, you can actually sit on this one. Thanks for coming. This is the new Iron Throne. War ensues. They start going to all lords to try and gain allyship and build up their side because this is going to come to war. And now kids are dying. That's all you need to know.
Yep. It's exciting, and I again wonder, what changes they are going to make, because I imagine they will.
Well, we're seeing some of these characters, already pop up, like, the Strongs. One of them is Hand of the King already in these episodes. The other one's eyeing off Rhaenyra, licking his lips. The other one's already working his way into this, the Whispers, the Master of Whispers, and hearing all the gossip tales because he's got a club foot and his ears are his best asset. So we're seeing these major characters already show up in the show. If you're like me and you looked up on IMDb without reading this book, you would have seen who had more episodes, and that was the giveaway. But I never hated spoilers. Like, I've never really been against it. I kind of like knowing this information. I think it was a day one rule here at Nerdist Book Club: read the book, then watch the movie or the show. So I'm happy that we're all learning this together. We can be the insufferable friend that's like, that's not how it happened in the books, and I can't wait for
it. I love it, and I totally agree. I think unless it's something I'm just beyond obsessed with, which is rare, honestly. Where, and especially us through work, we will often get spoiled on things, through discussing, through prepping for things. So I'm excited to see kind of what this story is and also what comes after it, because I'm interested to kind of figure out what the pacing of the show is going to, and how long we're going to get with this sort of these characters, because we have seen, a year time jump leading up to now we have the older cast.
And now I understand just how necessary time jumps are, because we are covering ground here. Also, P.S. Sir Kristen Cole, you are my favorite. I was rooting for you. Kristen Cole's a dick.
I haven't watched the latest episode, but that is the sentiment that.
Well, now I'm reading the book and I know where it goes.
Yeah, which I find it fun, because then I get to sort of think about how are they going to portray this? Are they going to change? What are they going to bring in? So
true.
Woo, we did it.
This is the actual truth. The show is the actual truth of it.
Exactly. Versus the version that's been told by largely men over 100 years.
Yep. Who hates Sir Kristen Cole now, says Thierry Fournier. Wait. Theory. Theory? I've been asking this poor bastard for about 7 years how to say his name, and I'll put a new spin on it every couple of years. You can now tell people, don't be a Kristen Cole. The only way to not be a Kristen Cole is don't let your ego and the decisions that you made make you. This is a dude. Oh, you haven't seen it.
No, but I'm going to watch it tonight while I pack for a trip. So I will be all caught up.
Okay,
by the time.
I'm just going to ask, what do you think the most audacity-fueled request Sir Kristen could make of I keep calling her Daenerys, of Rhaenyra?
Make Me King?
Worse than that.
I don't know. I'm literally going to watch it at home because now I'm in the mood. So I'll text you. And we will discuss
second half of the book.
Second half of the book next week, which is your homework. Yes.
Homework, finish the book. We'll meet same time next week, 5 p.m. PT Wednesday, right here on Nerdist's YouTube page, Geek and Sundry's Twitch, and Nerdist's Facebook. Wherever you're joining us, a big hello to you. We're going to go full spoilers next week. Enjoy listening / reading. Keep the conversation happening on Twitter. If you want to use the hashtag Nerdist Book Club, that'd be amazing. We've got books for the rest of the year. We'd love to hear those suggestions, and pencil in another sneaky half an hour after next week's episode, because we will be going to the after show that takes place on Geek Bomb's Discord. It is a paid perk for Patreon. So head over to patreon.com/geekbomb. It's the lowest tier. Sign up to that. You get access. It's not streamed, broadcast, or recorded. So all conversations that happen there are very, very hush-hush in that community. And we have a lot of fun, and everyone gets a chance to ask questions and theorize as well. So we'll see you there next week. Thank you so much for joining us. And that was Zelda.
Perfect. Bye.
Bye, everyone.